Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
Let's continue our series on concubines in Islam. Now, Dr. Shabir, I want to turn now to the Prophet Muhammad. And we know that the Prophet Muhammad, or we are told in the hadith reports, that the Prophet Muhammad had concubines. Two of them, he actually, they were captives of war, and he married them. So Safiya and Juwariya. But then there are two others that are less clear. So there are Maria and Rayhana. So Dr. Shabir, were these concubines? How did it work?
Okay, so just to be clear, based on what we explained previously about, the history of concubinage and so on, Juwariya and Safiya would not count as concubines because they were they were initially captives of war, and being captives of war, by default, they would be slaves to the Muslim community.
You're correct. So they were slaves. They were slave women who were married.
Who are married to the Prophet, peace be upon him.
In alignment with the Quranic verses that we mentioned earlier.
Yes. So our traditional narratives say that the Prophet, peace be upon him, freed them and married them. Now, in the case of Safiya, interestingly enough, it is mentioned that when the Prophet, peace be upon him, took her into his apartment, the people were waiting to see, whether the Prophet, peace be upon him, would impose the veil on her. Because if he did, then that would mean that he took her as a wife. And if he didn't, that would mean that he keeps her as a slave girl. And that shows that marriage was very rudimentary at the time. The whole procedure was very simple.
Casual,
and yes. So people may not have easily drawn that distinction, or they may not have even known so clearly if a certain person was with the Prophet, peace be upon him, as a wife or as a slave girl. So we have to bear that in mind as we look at the whole scenario. But basically, it'll be interesting for us to, for those who are not so familiar with who Maria is and so on, to talk about the story of how she came to be with the Prophet, peace be upon him. And then we can look at the argument of those who would say that she was actually married to the Prophet, peace be upon him.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about Maria, Dr. Shabir.
Yeah, so it is mentioned that in about the 6th year of the Prophet's migration to Medina, he had sent out some letters to various leaders in surrounding polities. And he got various responses. So one of the letters was sent to the Patriarch of Egypt, who is referred to as Muqawqis in the Islamic tradition. Muqawqis sent a reply letter saying something like he was expecting a prophet to come, but he thought the prophet would be in Syria. Nevertheless, he is responding in kindness. He sends some material possessions to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a gift. And among these material possessions, he sent 2 girls, Maria and her sister Syrian. They're given by name. And he says to the Prophet, peace be upon him, in the letter, these girls are from a noble family, so treat them well. Now, the Prophet, peace be upon him, received these 2 girls, and the classical Islamic tradition says that because they were sisters, the Prophet, peace be upon him, could not keep them both as his consorts. He kept Maria, and he gave over Syrian to one of his companions, Hassan ibn Thabit. And later on, it is mentioned that eventually Maria, who is referred to as Maria as Al-Qibtiyya, Maria, the Coptic woman, she gave birth to a son to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the son's name was Ibrahim. But this son died in his infancy. He was only 18 months old when he passed away. 3 years or so, 4 years later, the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself passed away, meaning from the time that Maria came to live with him. And Maria herself passed away about 5 years after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And that's where the story about her really ends.
So why do you think, Dr. Shabir, that the Prophet could have been married to Maria?
Well, one indication I've already mentioned with the case of Safiya, where people were not so clear as to, whether this is a marriage or not. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, could very well have been married to her. But let me expand upon that and say that what we have seen from the Quran already has encouraged Muslims to marry off the slave women. So it is easy to imagine that the Prophet, peace be upon him, being the prime follower of the Quran, like he is instructed to follow the dictates of Allah, much as we are instructed to follow the dictates of Allah. It's his God as well. So God is telling him and us, marry off the slave girls, which means to marry them to somebody else. Or if in a situation you fear that you will not be doing justice, as we saw from Surah 4, verse number 3, then you yourself marry the women who are in your possession. So when he's given this instruction to marry or to marry off the slave girls, then on what basis is he going to keep them as his consorts without marriage? It doesn't seem to fit together. Moreover, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself is noted in hadiths to have encouraged not only the freedom of slaves in general, as the Quran also encourages the freedom of slaves in general, set them free. This is we should have actually begun there. The Quran is encouraging people to set the slaves, both male and female, free altogether. Mm-hmm. So we don't even have any control over whom they're going to get married. They will be free persons. They can decide for themselves whom they want to get married to. And this is what we saw that the Prophet, peace be upon him, did in the case of Juwairiya and Safiya. They were taken as captives of war when their people were at war with the Prophet, peace be upon him. But the Prophet, peace be upon him, freed them each and gave them the choice to marry him or not. And they chose to marry him. Now, that is what we could expect that the Prophet, peace be upon him, did across the board, whether we're mentioning Maria al-Qibtiyya or some other person who is named as Rayhana, who is also listed in Islamic tradition as one of the possible persons with whom the Prophet, peace be upon him, had a private relationship as one of his consorts. And so the Prophet, peace be upon him, can be expected to have followed his own lead. He should have set the example, rather than just tell other people, okay, you free the slaves and free the slave girls. More specifically, Safiya, there is a narrative in which the Prophet, peace be upon him, a hadith says, the Prophet in a hadith says that if a man were to teach his slave girl good manners and then marry her off, then free her and then get married to her, he will get a double reward. So, he will get a reward for, teaching her good manners, and then for freeing her, and then it looks like three things. He gets so if I remember the narrative right, it's like he's doing three good things here. But anyway, the hadith says he's gonna get a double reward because teaching her good manners, first of all, means a good thing, because if you have a slave person under your control, you can work them for your own gains. You can re-employ them to somebody else for wages, and you get the wages. But if you're going to take the time to teach them, that's time that they're going to be off work, right? So that means you're doing a good deed, a charitable deed here by teaching your slave girl or slave man, slave boy. And then if you free her, then that's a good deed. And then if you marry her, then that's a further good deed, because of the person's slave background and whatever, not so desirable to others when it comes to marriage. But you know that person and you get married to that person, well then, you're doing a good deed. So if the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is recommending to his followers to do this kind of good deed, now we know from other reports that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was almost the foremost in doing good things. If there was something good to be done, he would be at the forefront in doing it. To the extent that it is mentioned that once when the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his companions got down to camp, he was there gathering the firewood, and the people said, "But Messenger of God, we can do that for you." And he said that he didn't like for others to precede him in doing good things, something to that effect. So how would it be that he's recommending to others, teach your slave girls good manners, free them and marry them, and you get a double reward, but he himself is not seeking that double reward? It is more likely, therefore, given all of this, that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, actually gave Maria her freedom, if indeed she was a slave to begin with, because we didn't explore that in detail. Muqawqis sent her and said, he didn't say this is a slave girl. He said, this is a girl from a noble family. And this led a great scholar of Islam, Alama Shibli Nomani, to say that she wasn't a slave girl. She was sent to be given good treatment by the Prophet, peace be upon him, and good treatment obviously meant, what the Prophet, peace be upon him, did, which in his opinion was that the Prophet, peace be upon him, actually married her.
Interesting insights, Dr. Shabir. When we return, we will talk about some objections to the arguments that you've made. Thank you, Dr. Shabir.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this video, click like and subscribe, and please donate to support our work at QuranSpeaks.com.